She's 3 feet tall and furious, and the Empire says she's my commander. Welcome to the world of science fiction. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The magnetic hum of the deck plates vibrated through the soles of Sargent's worn combat boots, a constant and familiar companion that had been the soundtrack to the last 15 years of his life. It was a sound that meant he was alive, encased in the manufactured safety of an Imperial warship, a temporary reprieve between deployments that were becoming increasingly indistinguishable from one another. He ran a hand over the back of his neck, the rough calluses of his palms scraping against the stubble and the intricate scar tissue that snaked up from his collar, a permanent reminder of a close encounter with a berserker on Cygnus 10-1. The summons had been abrupt, a crisp chime on his personal that cut through the low-stakes card game he'd been methodically losing to, his squad's heavy weapons specialist. Admiral's briefing, Deck 2, 800 sharp. There was no room for interpretation in an Imperial summons, only obedience, a principle had long ago accepted as the cornerstone of survival. He moved through the gunmetal gray corridors of the Vindicator, the massive warship a city in the void, its passageways smelling of ozone, recycled air, and the faint, metallic tang of ordnance. His reflection was a distorted ghost in the polished steel walls, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose face was a roadmap of forgotten campaigns, the lines etched around his eyes and mouth speaking of grim determination rather than joy. He adjusted the fit of his dark fatigues, the fabric clean but perpetually creased, a stark contrast to the spit-and-polish officers who rarely saw the mud and blood of a ground deployment. He knew what this was about, or at least he thought he did. Another campaign, another world to be or secured, another meat grinder where the primary resource expended would be the lives of men like him. The Admiralty saw the galaxy in terms of strategic assets and acceptable losses, and he and his squad were firmly in the latter category, a precision tool to be used until it broke. Entering the briefing room, felt the familiar shift in atmosphere, the air here colder and sharper, designed for strategic thought rather than human comfort. The chamber was circular, dominated by a large holographic table that currently displayed the swirling, chaotic nebula of the Outer Rim territories. Admiral stood at the far side of the table, his immaculate white uniform a beacon of authority, his posture as rigid as the warship's frame. He was a man who commanded from a distance, whose hands were clean because others did the dirty work. Rhino Squad was already assembled, standing at parade rest with a discipline born of shared hardship. Was a mountain of a man, his arms thicker than most men's legs, his face a placid mask that concealed a surprisingly sharp tactical mind. Beside him, Cora, their tech specialist, was practically vibrating with nervous energy, her fingers subtly twitching as if itching for a console to hack. 2 other Legionnaires, Rook and Patches, completed their small unit, their expressions as stoic and unreadable as his own. They were survivors, a tightly knit group who had learned to rely on each other when Imperial strategy inevitably failed them on the ground. Took his position at the head of his men, giving the Admiral a sharp, economical nod. He didn't waste energy on pleasantries, and didn't expect them. His eyes scanned the hollow table, his mind already working, dismissing 90% of the swirling star chart as irrelevant, focusing on the blinking systems that represented active or potential flashpoints. He was a professional, and his professionalism demanded that he prepare for the worst, even if it meant listening to another of long-winded speeches about glory and imperial destiny. "Sergeant, thank you for joining us," the Admiral began, his voice smooth and cultured, a stark contrast to the guttural shouts of battlefield command. "I have a new assignment for your squad, one of the utmost importance to the security of the Empire." Kept his expression neutral, his gaze fixed on the Admiral, though his peripheral vision was absorbing every detail on the tactical display. Utmost importance was a common refrain, a phrase used to justify sending good soldiers to die on worthless chunks of rock. Gestured to the hollow table, and the star chart zoomed in with dizzying speed, focusing on a single angry-looking star system shrouded in violent, swirling storms. A planet, a single fortress world, was highlighted in crimson. A cold knot formed in stomach. Wasn't just a deployment, it was a death sentence. The Legion had tried to reclaim it 3 times in the last century, and each attempt had ended in catastrophic failure, entire battle groups vanishing into the planet's impenetrable storms without so much as a final transmission. It was a place where Imperial doctrine went to die, a ghost story told to frighten recruits. Your objective, continued, oblivious to the sudden tension in the room, is to land on and retrieve a lost Imperial asset, the catalyst. Due to the unique environmental and strategic challenges presented by this world, your squad will be operating under a new commanding officer with specialized knowledge pertinent to the mission. This was new. Rhino Squad was an autonomous unit, typically operating under direct field command. A new CO was an unwelcome variable, an unknown quantity that could get them all killed. He braced himself for some arrogant young officer fresh from the academy, a political appointee with a famous name and 0 combat experience. But what stepped out from the shadows behind the Admiral was something far beyond his most cynical expectations. The being that emerged was tiny, so small that she had to step onto a reinforced crate brought from a side alcove, just so her head could clear the edge of the holographic table. She was, at most, 3 feet tall, a perfectly sculpted miniature of a woman, with skin the color of polished emerald and long, shimmering silver hair that fell to her waist. Her figure was surprisingly curvaceous for her petite frame, a detail that was both startling and utterly irrelevant in the face of the sheer, unadulterated fury that burned in her glowing violet eyes. Her custom-tailored black Imperial officer's uniform was immaculate, the commander's insignia on her collar seeming absurdly large. The silence in the room was absolute, the low hum of the ship suddenly deafening. Felt shift his weight beside him, a silent expression of disbelief. Himself simply stared, his mind struggling to process the sight. He had fought alongside hulking and wiry mercenaries, but he had never been asked to take orders from something that looked like a child's angry doll. His jaw tightened, the muscles in his neck cording. This wasn't a commander. It was a joke, a mascot, or worse, some kind of biological key the Empire was using for a purpose they wouldn't disclose. His skepticism wasn't born of prejudice against a non-human, but from a veteran's cold, hard pragmatism. War was a brutal calculus of size, strength, and firepower, and this creature possessed none of the above. She was a liability, a fragile piece of glass being sent into a hurricane, and they were the poor bastards ordered to carry her. The alien commander's violet gaze swept over the squad, lingering on each of them for a moment before settling on. She saw it. She saw the doubt, the professional shock, the assessment that wrote her off as a non-threat. A flicker of something dangerous danced in her eyes, a spark of indignation that seemed to make the very air around her crackle. She didn't wait for the Admiral to finish his introductions. "That will be all, Admiral," she said, her voice shockingly clear and powerful, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. It held no trace of alien inflection, only the crisp, clipped tones of someone accustomed to absolute command. To his credit, looked momentarily startled before composing himself and giving a curt nod, stepping back as if ceding the stage. The tiny commander placed her small, 3-fingered hands on the edge of the hollow table, her glowing eyes boring into the tactical display. The mission, too, is not a standard asset retrieval. It is a surgical strike into a Class Omega storm world that has consumed 3 prior legionary expeditions. Her gaze shot up, pinning. Expeditions led by seasoned commanders who relied on Imperial doctrine that is, for this particular environment, fatally flawed. With a flick of her wrist, she manipulated the holographic display. New windows appeared, filled with after-action reports and casualty lists from the failed missions. Operation 70 years ago. Commander, he attempted a brute force atmospheric entry. His fleet was torn apart by gravitational shears his sensors couldn't even detect. A failure of intelligence. Another flick. Operation Ghost Talon 42 years ago. Commander, He used smaller, stealth insertion craft. An improvement, but he failed to account for the planet's biopredators, which hunt using electroreception. His squads were wiped out within 3 hours of landing, a failure of biology. Her voice was a merciless indictment, each word a hammer blow against the Legion's pride. She dissected the failures with a brutal efficiency that was both insulting and undeniably accurate. She brought up targeting data, atmospheric pressure charts, and autopsy reports that had never been privy to, information that was clearly classified at the highest levels. Listened, his initial shock slowly being replaced by a grudging, ice-cold respect. The creature was arrogant, her tone dismissive and her presence infuriating, but she wasn't wrong. Her analysis was flawless, identifying the exact points of failure he himself had suspected after reading the heavily redacted public reports. She knew her subject matter with an impossible level of detail. She wasn't just a commander, she was a scholar of this specific brand of death. "Your imperial tactics," she continued, her voice dripping with contempt as she gestured dismissively at the reports of legionary heroes, "are based on overwhelming force, predictable assault patterns, and a fundamental misunderstanding of anything that does not march in lockstep with your primitive philosophies. This is a recipe for suicide." She then completely erased the old mission plans, the screen wiping clean before a new, intricate flight path materialized, a terrifying corkscrew trajectory that wound its way through the planet's storm systems, seemingly at random. "We will not be fighting the storm. We will be using it. Our entry will be masked by the gravimetric shears, our approach shielded by the very energy that destroyed your previous fleets. We will land during the peak electrical cycle, which will blind the native predators. We will move faster, quieter, and more intelligently than any Imperial force has before." Her plan was insane. It was a beautiful, elegant, and utterly suicidal piece of tactical artistry. It relied on 1,000 variables aligning perfectly, on a level of piloting and environmental knowledge that no human possessed. It relied on her. The briefing concluded with the stark objective laid bare. Land, move to a designated set of coordinates deep within the planet's most hostile region, secure the catalyst, and await extraction. It was a clean, simple, and impossible mission. The hollow table powered down, leaving the room in a dimmer, more intimate light. The other members of Rhino Squad were still, processing the sheer audacity of the plan and their new commander. Could feel their eyes on him, waiting for his lead. He held his silence, his mind racing, weighing the cold, hard facts of her analysis against the sheer insanity of her proposed solution. She had demonstrated her intelligence, but she had done nothing to earn his trust, a commodity far more valuable than brilliance in the field. As if sensing his final reservations, the commander, as the admiral had belatedly named her, fixed him with her intense, violet stare. She hadn't moved from her crate, yet she somehow seemed to loom over him. "You have a problem, Sergeant." The question was a direct challenge, thrown like a gauntlet onto the cold steel deck. Met her gaze without flinching, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken conflict. He chose his words carefully, his voice a low gravel that was the product of too much shouting and too little sleep. "My only problem," he said, his tone flat and devoid of insubordination, yet heavy with the weight of experience, "is a mission that's already killed better men than me, Commander." Her eyes narrowed into furious slits, the violet light within them intensifying. The battle had not yet begun, but the war between the grizzled human sergeant and his 3-foot-tall commander had just been declared. The transit to the system was a long, cold crucible, a period of enforced proximity that ground on already frayed nerves. Their new commander did not believe in downtime, viewing it as a weakness the universe would inevitably punish. So Rhino Squad was subjected to a relentless series of drills in the Vindicator's cavernous training bays. These were not the standard combat simulations had run 1,000 times before. Gilly had personally the simulators with data, creating scenarios that were actively hostile and seemingly unwinnable. The plates would shift unpredictably to mimic the planet's gravitational anomalies, sending the soldiers stumbling while holographic predators with terrifying speed and impossible attack vectors swarmed them from all sides. Gilly would observe from a raised platform, her small form silhouetted against the simulation's chaotic light, her voice cutting through the sounds of pulse fire and shouting with sharp, merciless critiques. She pushed them to abandon their training, to unlearn the muscle memory that had kept them alive on a dozen other worlds, demanding a fluid, reactive combat style that felt dangerously close to chaos. It was here that she clashed with the brutal regularity of opposing tides, their arguments echoing in the training bay long after the simulations had ended. He would stand before her, his massive frame dripping with sweat, arguing for the proven tactics of cover and controlled fire, for the methodical, disciplined advance that was the hallmark of the Imperial Legion. He insisted on the importance of established formations and overlapping fields of fire, the bedrock principles that had saved his life more times than he could count. But she would dismiss his experience with a wave of her hand, her violet eyes blazing with an impatience that bordered on contempt. "Your formations are rigid, Sergeant," she would declare, her voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "They are predictable. The predators do not fight with honor or tactics. They are chaos given teeth and claws, and they will use your beautifully organized firing lines as a convenient buffet. You must learn to scatter, to flow, to use the environment as a weapon and a shield, and to trust that your squad mates can fight independently without needing to hold hands in a perfect perimeter." His protests that her methods would lead to the squad being isolated and picked off one by one were met with a cold fury. "They will be isolated either way, Sergeant. The difference is whether they are isolated and waiting to be killed, or isolated and actively killing. Your doctrine is a tombstone. I am offering them a chance at survival." The arguments were circular and maddening, with championing the hard-won wisdom of experience while she championed a radical, theoretical approach that seemed to defy all military logic. Yet, despite his deep-seated resistance, he could not deny the results. After a week of her grueling regimen, his squad was moving faster, reacting with a newfound, instinctual cohesion. Learned to use the ricochet of his heavy blaster off the shifting walls, while Cora integrated her hacking skills on the fly, momentarily disabling holographic foes to create openings for the others. They were exhausted, bruised, and perpetually on edge, but they were adapting, their survival rates in the impossible simulations ticking slowly, painfully, upward. Watched them, a knot of conflict tightening in his gut. He hated her methods, but he was a pragmatist above all else, and he could not ignore the fact that his team was becoming deadlier, more resilient, and better prepared for a hell he could barely imagine. The inevitable crisis came without warning, halfway through their journey, while they were traversing a stretch of supposedly empty space known for its unpredictable plasma storms. The ship's klaxons blared to life, a shrieking, metallic scream that ripped through the vessel's monotonous hum, the emergency lighting casting the corridors in a blood-red glow. The entire warship groaned, lurching violently as a wave of energized particles slammed into its shields. On his way back from yet another tense session in the training bay, was thrown against a bulkhead, his armor taking the brunt of the impact. He immediately recognized the sound and the sensation. This was no mere turbulence, but a full-blown plasma storm of a magnitude that should have been detected and avoided hours in advance. He began moving towards the bridge, his combat instincts taking over as he pushed his way through panicked crewmen scurrying in the red-lit chaos. The ship bucked again, harder this time, and the primary lights flickered and died, plunging them into the hellish emergency lighting for good. When he finally forced his way onto the bridge, he found a scene of controlled pandemonium. Officers were shouting conflicting reports, their faces pale in the glow of sparking consoles. The main was a terrifying maelstrom of swirling, incandescent gas, the storm a living entity that was trying to swallow the Vindicator whole. Admiral was gripping his command chair, his usual composure shattered, his face a mask of disbelief as he yelled for damage reports that were either not coming or were too grim to contemplate. In the center of this chaos, a single point of stillness existed. Commander Gilly stood by the central hollow table, which was flickering erratically, her expression one of intense, focused calm. She seemed utterly unfazed by the violent shaking of the deck or the cacophony of alarms, her glowing violet eyes fixed on the maelstrom outside, as if it were a complex puzzle she was methodically solving. As another wave rocked the ship and a navigator screamed that the primary guidance system was offline, Gilly finally moved. "Silence," she commanded, and the power in her voice cut through the noise, stunning the bridge crew into a temporary, shocked obedience. Her eyes scanned the frantic officers before locking onto as he stood near the entrance. "Here now," she barked, pointing to an auxiliary console near the forward viewport, a station usually reserved for manual astrogation overrides, a relic of older ship designs. Didn't hesitate, his training overriding any personal animosity as he shoved past two stunned lieutenants and planted himself in the chair, his hands hovering over the controls. He saw immediately that the main navigation was a sea of red error messages, completely useless. "The ship's automated systems can't process the fractal patterns of the storm," Gilly explained, her voice sharp and devoid of any panic as she strode over to stand behind him. "They are trying to find a logical path where none exists. We must fly through it manually." A wave of disbelief washed over the bridge. Flying a vessel the size of the Vindicator manually through a storm like this was not just impossible, it was ludicrous. It was like trying to perform neurosurgery with a sledgehammer during an earthquake. "I will give you the course corrections," Gilly stated, her eyes now fixed on the swirling chaos of her expression one of utter concentration. "Your job, Sergeant, is to input them precisely as I give them, without delay and without question. Can you do that?" Hands settled firmly on the console's twin control yokes, his fingers finding the input keys by touch alone. He didn't waste breath on an answer, instead giving a single, sharp nod, his own focus narrowing until the entire universe consisted of only the console before him, the storm on the screen, and the small, alien commander at his back. Then the commands began, a rapid-fire torrent of numbers and technical jargon that flowed from her with an unnatural speed. "Rudder to port, 3.17 degrees. Engage ventral thrusters, 2-second burst, power at 40%. Now. Pitch adjustment, +5 degrees, dampen inertial compensators to half. Input helm vector Alpha 60. His hands flew across the controls, his mind and body a seamless extension of her will. He didn't understand the calculations she was making, sensing the subtle shifts in the storm's energy and translating them into precise mechanical instructions, but he didn't need to. He was a soldier, a professional, and his role was to execute. The ship groaned and shuddered as he inputted the commands, but it began to respond, the violent, random lurches being replaced by a more controlled, deliberate movement. The bridge crew stared, their panic forgotten, replaced by a stunned awe as they watched the unlikely duo work. For what felt like an eternity, they were locked in this strange, intimate dance. Gilly would call out her impossible calculations, her voice a steady anchor in the storm, and would execute them with flawless, immediate precision. She was the mind, he was the hands, and together they were guiding the colossal warship through a gauntlet that should have torn it to scrap metal. He could feel the strain on the ship's frame through the vibrations in the deck, hear the tortured shriek of the hull as they passed perilously close to a dense filament of plasma, but his focus never wavered. He moved with an economy of motion honed by years of combat, his hands steady and sure. At one point, a particularly violent jolt sent a shower of sparks down from the ceiling, and the small commander stumbled, her hand briefly bracing on the back of his chair. He felt the small, firm pressure through the armored plating, a fleeting connection in the midst of the chaos, before she righted herself and continued issuing commands without missing a beat. Then, as suddenly as it began, the violent shaking subsided. The terrifying roar of the storm against the shields diminished to a low hum, and the shifted from a blinding wall of energy to the familiar, peaceful blackness of space, speckled with the distant, steady light of stars. A collective, ragged breath was exhaled by the entire bridge crew. They had made it through. A slow, stunned applause began to break out, but Gilly silenced it with a single, sharp glance. Let his hands fall from the controls, the adrenaline slowly beginning to recede, leaving behind a profound exhaustion. He leaned back in the chair, the silence of the bridge now more pronounced than the earlier chaos. He turned his head to look at the commander who was still standing behind him. Her silver hair was slightly, and for the first time he saw not fury or impatience in her violet eyes, but the deep, weary satisfaction of a crisis overcome. Her gaze met his, and in that quiet moment, something shifted between them. He had seen her ability, not as a theoretical lecture, but as a raw, undeniable force that had just saved all their lives. She, in turn, had seen him not as a stubborn, doctrinaire subordinate, but as a perfectly competent and unshakably calm instrument of action. No words were exchanged, none were needed. A thin, fragile thread of grudging respect had been spun between them in the heart of the storm. It wasn't friendship, and it certainly wasn't trust, but it was a start. The descent into atmosphere was a controlled fall into madness, a violent testament to Gilly's insane and brilliant plan. Their small insertion craft, the Stiletto, detached from the Vindicator and immediately plunged into the swirling, incandescent clouds of the planet's upper atmosphere, where it was caught and tossed about like a leaf in a hurricane. Alarms screamed in a constant, unheeded chorus as the ship's hull protested the immense gravimetric forces, the metal groaning a tortured symphony around them. Was strapped into his crash harness so tightly that his muscles ached, his knuckles white as he gripped the restraints, his gaze fixed on the small form of his commander. Gilly stood unstrapped at the forward navigation console, her feet planted wide on the magnetized deck, her hands flying across the holographic controls with a speed that human comprehension. She was a conductor orchestrating their fall, her eyes fixed on the storm outside, not with fear, but with an eerie, predatory focus as she shouted course corrections to the pilot, her voice never wavering even as the ship dropped 1,000 feet in a single, stomach-turning lurch. Could feel the expertise of the pilot fighting against the storm, but it was Gilly's instincts that kept them from being atomized, her command seeming to anticipate the storm's chaotic whims, finding impossible paths through the maelstrom. Just as it seemed they might actually survive the insane trajectory, a web of emerald lightning, thicker than the ship itself, erupted directly in their path. The pilot screamed a warning, but it was too late. The energy discharge slammed into their port side, and the world dissolved into a cacophony of shrieking metal and a blinding white flash. The Stiletto was sent into an uncontrolled spin, its engines dead, its systems fried, tumbling end over end toward the surface of the planet below. His world was a blur of G-forces and the frantic, terrified shouts of his squad, the red emergency lights painting a hellish tableau inside the cabin. He saw Cora thrown from her seat despite her harness, her helmet cracking against a support beam with a sickening thud. He saw trying to brace a failing cargo container with his immense strength, his face a mask of raw effort. Through the chaos, he caught a glimpse of Gilly, no longer at the console but clinging to a stanchion, her small body rigid against the impossible forces. The final impact was not a crash so much as a cataclysmic collision, a moment where all sound and motion converged into a single, deafening, bone-shattering finality. Then there was only darkness, the ringing in his ears and the smell of burnt wiring and ozone. Consciousness returned to in painful, fragmented waves. He hung upside down in his harness, the blood rushing to his head, his vision swimming. A deep, ragged breath confirmed no broken ribs, and a quick mental inventory revealed a collection of deep bruises and a splitting headache, but nothing critical. He unbuckled his harness and fell heavily to what was now the floor, the ship having come to rest on its side. His first instinct, the ingrained training of 100 battlefields, took over immediately. Rhino squad, sound off. he roared, his voice hoarse, pushing through the pain as he activated the emergency floodlights on his helmet, cutting a bright white beam through the smoky darkness. "Here, Sarge, think my shoulders popped, but I'm in one piece," came the rough reply from a pile of debris. "Cora." "Rook Patches." A groan from near the cockpit was Rook. Patches answered with a pained affirmative, but Cora was silent. Found her slumped against the bulkhead, unconscious, a nasty gash on her forehead but thankfully still breathing. They were alive, battered and broken, but alive. He looked for Gilly, his light sweeping across the wreckage. He found her near the shattered remnants of the navigation console, already on her feet, a thin trickle of violet blood running from her temple, her silver hair matted with grime. She was staring at the mangled communications panel, her expression grim. "The long-range comms are destroyed," she stated, her voice flat. "We're cut off from the Vindicator." They forced open a buckled emergency hatch and stepped out into the nightmare of. The air was thick and tasted of metal and rain, rent by the constant, deafening roar of the wind and the crackle of lightning that spiderwebbed across the bruised purple sky. Jagged black rock formations, carved into cruel shapes by of storms, clawed at the heavens. The ground was a treacherous mix of mud and razor-sharp shale, littered with the skeletal, metallic ruins of some ancient civilization, and they were being hunted. Saw them first, fleeting silhouettes against the strobing flashes of lightning, creatures that moved with a terrifying, bird-like speed. They were large, winged predators, their forms sleek and aerodynamic, their claws glinting like obsidian. They seemed to ride the storm's electrical currents, appearing and disappearing with the lightning, their hunting ground the chaos itself. His rifle was in his hands before he even registered the conscious thought. "Perimeter," he bellowed over the storm's roar. "Set up the heavy repeater on that outcrop. Rook Patches, cover the flanks. We've got company." His squad, despite their injuries, moved with the ingrained efficiency of veterans. They knew this dance, but this world was different. The creatures didn't attack in a predictable wave. They were smart, using the flashes of light and deafening thunder to mask their approaches. In this alien hellscape, combat experience was the only thing keeping them from being overwhelmed, his commands the solid bedrock in a world of chaos. He directed their fire, called out targets, and organized a tight, defensible position around the wreckage of the lander, turning their disaster into a fortress. While commanded the battle, Gilly commanded the environment. She stood in the center of their perimeter, her head tilted as if listening to a sound no one else could hear, her violet eyes closed. Her small form was a strange beacon of calm amidst the frantic exchange of pulse fire and the shrieks of the alien predators. "3 of them," she suddenly said, her voice cutting through the din. "Approaching from the east, low, using the magnetic interference from that rock spire to mask their approach." Instinctively pivoted, aiming his rifle where she had indicated, seeing nothing but rain and rock. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his tactical sense screaming that the position was empty. "Now, Sergeant," Gilly snapped. Trusting an instinct that wasn't his own, fired a 3-round burst into the darkness. A piercing shriek answered him, and a flash of lightning illuminated one of the creatures as it tumbled from the sky, its wings shattered. He stared in disbelief for a second before refocusing their fire. Gilly was not just guessing, she was seeing, feeling the electrical signatures of the creatures moving through the storm. She was their early warning system, their battlefield radar, her unique connection to the planet, their single greatest tactical advantage. They fought for what felt like hours, a desperate, bloody defense orchestrated by 2 commanders, one of war and one of the world itself. They were a perfect, if unwilling, partnership. And his squad provided the lethal force, the wall of steel and fire, while Gilly provided the vision, the supernatural awareness that allowed them to anticipate the enemy's every move. The ambush that finally broke their stalemate came from above. A larger variant of the creature, a matriarch perhaps, used a blinding, ground-shaking lightning strike as cover, diving straight down into the center of their perimeter. It moved with impossible speed, its talons extended, aimed directly at the one figure who was not looking up, the one person focused entirely on the planet's energy flows. Gilly. There was no time to think, no time for orders or analysis. There was only the ingrained, protective instinct of a soldier for the core of his mission, a reflex honed over years of shielding vital assets and comrades. Moved, launching himself forward in a desperate tackle, his armored form slamming into Gilly's small body. He knocked her clear, sending her skidding across the muddy ground, just as the creature's razor-sharp talons sliced through the air where she had been standing. He wasn't fast enough to avoid the attack completely. The tip of one talon, sharp as forged steel, caught his left arm, tearing through his combat armor and the flesh beneath like it was paper. A searing, white-hot pain exploded from his shoulder to his elbow, and he roared, a sound of pure rage and agony. He hit the ground hard, rolling and coming up onto one knee, his rifle already raised. Seeing the opening, let out a bellow and unleashed a sustained torrent of fire from his heavy repeater, stitching a line of plasma bolts across the creature's chest and sending it crashing lifelessly to the ground. The remaining predators, their leader fallen, shrieked in unison and melted back into the storm. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the wind, the rain, and his own ragged, pain-filled breaths as he stared down at the deep, ragged gash in his arm, blood welling up and dripping onto the dark soil. They found shelter soon after in a collapsed, ancient ruin, a hollowed-out structure that offered some respite from the relentless storm, while the others reinforced the entrance, sat heavily on a block of fallen stone, trying to tend to his arm. He had cut away the shredded sleeve of his uniform, exposing the wound. It was deep, the edges ragged, and it was bleeding far more than he was comfortable with. He was cycling through the options in his standard issue, knowing that none of them were truly adequate for a wound this severe, when a small shadow fell over him. He looked up to see Gilly standing before him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. She held a small, metallic cylinder in her hand. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the unspoken events of the battle hanging in the air between them. Her life had been saved by his actions, an act that went beyond the simple execution of orders. He had protected her. Without a word, she knelt in front of him and gently took his wounded arm, her touch surprisingly steady and firm. He flinched from the pain but didn't pull away. She opened the cylinder, revealing a thick, pearlescent substance that glowed with a soft, internal light. She scooped a small amount onto her fingers and began to apply it to the gash. The moment the salve touched his skin, a strange, cool sensation spread through his arm, instantly dulling the searing pain to a dull throb. He watched, completely mesmerized, as the glowing substance seemed to knit his flesh back together before his very eyes. The bleeding stopped, the ragged edges of the wound drew closed, and within a minute all that remained of the life-threatening injury was a thin, pink line and a faint, violet luminescence that slowly faded. He stared at his arm, then back at her face. Her violet eyes met his, and in their depths he saw no anger, no arrogance, only a quiet, profound acknowledgement. It was a truce, a gesture that transcended rank and species. He had saved her life, and she, in turn, had saved his. In the heart of that violent, hostile world, surrounded by darkness and danger, the soldier and his commander had finally found common ground. The days that followed their desperate stand at the crash site bled into one another, a grueling trek through the storm-racked bones of. A profound and unspoken shift had settled over the squad, a change in the very currents of their command structure, forged in the crucible of that first violent encounter. Now wielded his authority over the squad's tactical decisions with an unquestioned finality, organizing their marching formations, setting watches, and rationing their dwindling supplies with the grim efficiency of a lifelong soldier. He was their shield, his rifle and his experience the unbreachable wall that stood between them and the planet's relentless hostility. Yet, in all matters of navigation and strategy, he deferred completely to Gilly, accepting her strange and cryptic guidance as gospel. When she would stop abruptly, placing a hand on a humming black stone and declaring that they must turn west to avoid the angry earth, would simply relay the order, his trust in her supernatural senses now absolute. He had seen the proof of her connection to this world written in the blood of their enemies and the miraculous healing of his own flesh, and he was a pragmatist before all else. He did not need to understand a weapon to know that it worked. This new symbiosis made them a brutally effective unit, moving through the treacherous landscape with a purpose and speed that would have been impossible before. The 5 hardened soldiers forming a protective shell around the small, emerald-skinned oracle, who guided them toward their mysterious objective. As they drew closer to the coordinates in the mission briefing, an unsettling change began to come over Gilly. The calm, focused commander who had navigated a starship through a plasma storm and directed their defense against the native predators began to fray at the edges. A constant, agitated energy seemed to thrum just beneath her skin, and she would often fall silent for long stretches, her violet eyes distant as if she were listening to a conversation no one else could perceive. She suffered from crippling headaches that would force the entire squad to halt, her small hands pressed to her temples as she fought against some unseen, unfelt assault. Would watch her during these moments, a feeling of protective concern solidifying in his chest, an emotion he had long ago buried under layers of cynicism and scar tissue. He found himself ensuring she took her share of the rations, that her sleeping position was the most sheltered, small gestures of a commander looking after a vital specialist, or perhaps a man looking after a woman he was beginning to see as more than just an asset. Her distress grew with every mile they crossed. The very air of the planet, which she had once read with such clarity, now seeming to scream at her, a rising chorus of energy that was pushing her to her physical and mental limits. When they finally crested the last black ridge of rock, the source of the overwhelming energy was revealed, and understood the reason for her pain. Before them lay a structure so immense it comprehension, a citadel not built upon the mountain but carved from its very heart, its colossal spires of obsidian-like rock scraping the storm-racked clouds. It did not look like a fortress or a city, but like a living thing, a piece of the planet that had been given geometric form and a terrible, silent purpose. A low, resonant hum emanated from it, a sound that vibrated deep in its bones and which must have been an unbearable psychic shout to Gilly, who staggered, her breath catching in her throat as she gazed upon the home she had never known. The entrance to the citadel was a vast, seamless wall of the same black stone, yet as Gilly approached, her hand outstretched, a section of the wall shimmered and dissolved like smoke, revealing a gateway that opened into a silent, cavernous interior. The air inside was still and cold, carrying the scent of dust and ozone and something else, a strange, electric tang of immense, sleeping power. The squad moved in a tight, tactical formation, their helmet lights cutting sharp beams through the oppressive darkness, but the citadel seemed entirely empty, a tomb silent for untold centuries. The walls were not bare but covered in intricate, swirling patterns that pulsed with a faint, internal light, a soft violet glow that mirrored the color of Gilly's eyes. As they moved deeper, following a path that only she seemed to see, the humming intensified and strange, weightless motes of light began to drift through the air around them. There were no signs of battle, no remnants of the people who had built this place, only a profound and overwhelming sense of stillness, of a world holding its breath. His hand never strayed from his rifle, his every instinct screaming that they were in a place beyond human understanding, a place where the normal rules of combat and reality did not apply. His focus was entirely on his commander, who walked as if in a trance, her steps sure and unerring, drawn deeper and deeper into the heart of the great machine by an invisible, irresistible current. She led them not to a command center or a weapons vault, but to a chamber so vast that their lights could not find the ceiling, a place that felt more like a cathedral than any part of a military installation. The chamber was filled with row upon countless row of towering, translucent crystals, each one containing a shadowy, humanoid form suspended in its heart, a silent, sleeping army of waiting for a dawn that had never come. At the very center of this crystalline forest, on a raised dais, was a single, much larger crystal that pulsed with a brilliant, internal light, bathing the entire chamber in a soft, ethereal glow. Within this central crystal, floating in a timeless, peaceful stasis, was not a soldier or a king, but a child, a small girl who looked no older than 5, her silver hair drifting around her serene face. Stared, his mind reeling as he tried to reconcile this sight with his mission parameters. This was the catalyst. Not a weapon, not a power source, not a piece of data, but a living, breathing child. The sight was so fundamentally wrong, so contrary to the cold, tactical language of the briefing, that it shook him to his core. He looked at Gilly and saw that she was transfixed, her face a mask of awe, confusion, and dawning horror. She stepped forward as if mesmerized, her hand rising to touch the smooth, warm surface of the crystal. The moment her emerald skin made contact, the entire chamber flared with an intense, blinding light, and a wave of pure information, of raw memory and emotion washed over them. It wasn't a hologram or a recording. It was a direct, psychic broadcast, a story pouring directly into their minds. Was thrown back by the force of it, crying out as images and sounds filled his head, the history of a doomed and noble people unfolding in a single, devastating instant. He saw a vibrant, powerful civilization that had lived in harmony with their stormy world, not as its masters but as its symbiotic partners. He saw them discover a terrible cosmic truth, a flaw in the fabric of their reality, a source of immense, destructive energy that their planet served as a natural cage for. They were not conquerors. They were jailers, the guardians of a prison that held back an unimaginable galactic threat. He witnessed their terrible choice, the great sacrifice they made when they realized their civilization's growing power might one day inadvertently unlock the cage. To protect the universe, they chose to sleep, to place their entire race into stasis within the heart of their world, transforming their planet into a fortress and their technology into an automated, lethal defense system that would repel any and all intruders. The child in the crystal was the final piece of their plan, the key to their salvation and the galaxy's. She was not a prisoner, but her unique genetic signature, the only thing that could pacify the planet's defenses, access the stasis controls, and if the time ever came, awaken their people. The psychic wave receded, leaving on his knees, gasping for breath, the sheer weight of the revelation pressing down on him. He looked over at Gilly, who had collapsed at the base of the crystal, her body racked with silent, heartbreaking sobs. The truth she had received was far more personal, far more cruel. She saw her own origins, a small survey team of her ancestors, lost in deep space generations ago, a forgotten branch of the people. She saw the Empire finding the wreckage of their ship, discovering the dormant genetic markers in their bloodline, and realizing what they had found. They hadn't rescued her people. They had harvested them, cultivating her lineage in secret, waiting for the one descendant whose genetics were a perfect match for the key. Her entire life, her training in the Imperial Academy, her rapid rise to the rank of commander, it was all a lie, a carefully constructed path to lead this one, perfect key back to the lock. She wasn't the last hope of a defeated race. She was a custom-grown tool, an instrument of cosmic burglary, designed to be used and then discarded. As Gilly's grief washed over her, Cora, who had been working feverishly on a nearby console that had flickered to life, let out a choked gasp. "Sarge, you need to see this," staggered to his feet and joined her at the dusty terminal. It was an Imperial, scorched and damaged, clearly left behind by a previous failed mission. Cora had managed to access a few corrupted log files, the last testament of an Imperial intelligence officer. Read the cold, clinical text, and the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with sickening clarity. The log spoke of Project Catalyst and the biokey acquisition. It detailed the Empire's discovery of the energy source and their lust for it, a power that would make their fleet unstoppable. It mentioned the Descendant, asset designation G7, and the plan to use her to pacify the planetary defense grid. The final, chilling entry laid the betrayal bare. Upon successful unlocking of the primary energy source, Asset G7 is to be considered compromised and must be neutralized. The asset cannot be allowed to interface with the stasis controls. The awakening of the host population would represent an unacceptable strategic complication. Neutralized. He looked at the word, then at Gilly, still crumpled on the floor, her small frame shaking with the weight of her shattered world. They were never meant to leave. She was meant to open the door, and he and his squad were meant to put a bullet in the back of her head before she could awaken her people. The cold, cynical rage that had been his constant companion for years began to boil, transforming into something hotter, something. The Empire hadn't just lied to them. It had made them pawns in the planned desecration of a noble race and the murder of the woman who had saved their lives. He looked from Gilly to the sleeping child in the crystal, then to his squad, their faces grim and horrified in the crystal's light. The mission was a lie. Their orders were a crime. And in the silent, sacred heart of a sleeping world, Sargent realized his war with the Empire had just begun. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the crystal chamber in the wake of the devastating revelation, a quiet so profound it seemed to absorb all sound and hope. The soft, ambient light of the stasis pods pulsed around them, illuminating a scene of quiet despair and simmering fury. Rhino Squad stood frozen, their weapons held loosely, their faces etched with a mixture of horror and disgust as they processed the sheer, calculated cruelty of the Empire they had served. Cora had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide, whilst normally placid features were contorted into a thunderous scowl, his huge fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. In the center of it all was Gilly, a small, broken figure at the base of the glowing crystal, her grief a palpable force that seemed to drain the very warmth from the air. Felt a cold, deliberate rage solidifying in his soul, a feeling far and more potent than the weary cynicism he had carried for years. This was not the casual, bureaucratic callousness of the Empire he knew. This was a monstrous, generational betrayal, a crime so profound it felt like a violation of the natural order of the universe. He took a step toward Gilly, his intent to offer some form of comfort, however inadequate, but was stopped by a sudden, jarring chirp from Cora's, a sound of mundane technology that was utterly profane in the sacred stillness of the chamber. All heads snapped towards her as she looked down at the device, her face paling. "Sarge," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "It's the priority channel, a pre-scheduled check-in from the Vindicator. It's Admiral." The Admiral's voice, when it crackled to life from the speaker, was as smooth and confident as it had been in the briefing room, a sound of distant, untouchable authority that made teeth ache. "Commander Hay, report your status. We have been monitoring intermittent energy signatures from your location and assume you have reached the objective." The disembodied voice was a splash of ice water, shocking them out of their paralysis and forcing an immediate, impossible choice. Every instinct had screamed at him to smash the device, to cut the final tie to their duplicitous masters, but he knew that silence would be as much of a confession as defiance. They needed time, a commodity more precious than water or ammunition at that moment. His eyes met Gilly's across the chamber. He saw her flinch at the sound of the Admiral's voice, her grief momentarily eclipsed by a flash of pure, undiluted hatred in her violet eyes. He saw the struggle on her face, the conflict between her raw, exposed pain and the ingrained discipline of a commander. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod, a silent message of support, a promise that he was with her, no matter what came next. A deep breath shuddered through her small frame, and when she rose to her feet, the broken, grieving child was gone, replaced once more by the commander, her fury now a focused, weaponized shield. She strode over to her posture rigid, her face an unreadable mask of military professionalism. "Admiral, this is Commander Hay," she said, her voice impossibly steady, betraying none of the turmoil raging within her. "We have reached the objective. The information in your briefing was incomplete." There was a pause on the other end, a moment of calculated silence. "Elaborate, Commander's voice returned, a new, subtle edge of caution in his tone. Gilly glanced at the crystal containing the sleeping child, then before continuing, choosing her words with a surgeon's precision. "The asset, the catalyst, is not a piece of technology, Admiral. It appears to be a biological component integrated into a much larger system. The facility's defenses are tied directly to it. Attempting a forced extraction would be counterproductive. We need to analyze the interface before proceeding. Felt a surge of pride as he listened to her masterful performance. She was feeding a version of the truth, a lie wrapped in a technical accuracy he couldn't easily dispute, buying them the time they so desperately needed. She was not just a savant with a connection to the planet. She was a brilliant strategist, capable of waging a war of words with the same deadly precision she had used to navigate the plasma storm. "Understood, Commander," the Admiral replied after another long pause, clearly processing this new information. "Your new orders are to maintain your position and begin your analysis. Do not, I repeat, do not attempt to interface with the primary system until you receive further instructions. Secure the asset and await my command. Out." The channel went dead, plunging the chamber back into its profound silence. Gilly stood motionless for a long moment, her rigid posture holding until the last echo of the Admiral's voice had faded, and then she swayed, the immense strain of the deception causing her legs to buckle. Was there in an instant, his large hand steadying her by the shoulder before she could fall, the warmth of his touch grounding her in the overwhelming reality of their new situation. They were no longer soldiers of the Empire. They were fugitives, rebels, the sole guardians of a sleeping world, and their former masters now believed them to be a loose end that would soon need to be tied off. In the hours that followed, a new sense of purpose began to settle over the small, renegade squad. Found a defensible antechamber not far from the crystalline heart of the Citadel, a smaller room that was more easily secured, and declared it their temporary command center. He posted and Patches on watch, while Rook helped Cora tend to her head wound. The immediate, life-or-death crisis had passed, replaced by the crushing weight of their future, a vast and uncertain expanse of time in which they were the sole enemies of a galactic empire. Found Gilly sitting alone on a low stone ledge, her knees drawn up to her chest, her arms wrapped around them as she stared at the pulsing light of the Citadel's walls. The furious commander had vanished again, leaving behind a small, lost figure overwhelmed by the enormity of her stolen life. He approached quietly, the sound of his armored boots softened by the strange acoustics of the room, and sat not beside her, but a respectful distance away, leaning his pulse rifle against the wall. He didn't offer empty words of comfort or hollow reassurances. Instead, he simply began to field strip his rifle, the familiar, methodical clicks of the weapon's disassembly a strangely soothing sound in the alien silence. "They called it the evacuation," he said after a long while, his voice a low rumble, not looking at her but at the rifle components in his hands. "It was a mining colony on the fringe, got caught between us and a fleet. Imperial Command promised reinforcements, told the colonists to hold their ground." He paused, his hands stilling for a moment. The reinforcements never came. High Command had already written the colony off. They just wanted to waste men and materiel taking it, to soften them up for our main fleet. We were the cleanup crew. We got there and found nothing but ruins and ghosts. The Empire had sacrificed 30,000 of its own citizens to gain a minor strategic advantage. He finally turned to look at her, his face grim in the violet light. "That was the day I stopped believing in the glorious cause. I still followed orders, did my duty, protected my squad, because that's all I had left. But the Empire is just a machine, Commander. It doesn't care about justice or truth. It only cares about power. It consumes worlds and people to fuel itself. What they did to you, it's not the exception, it's the rule." Gilly listened to his story, her head still bowed, but the violent trembling in her shoulders had subsided. His confession, his own moment of profound disillusionment, had built a bridge across the abyss of her grief. She was not alone in her betrayal. She finally lifted her head, her violet eyes red-rimmed but now burning with a new, different kind of fire. The grief was still there, a deep, permanent wound, but it was now being tempered by a cold, hard resolve. "My entire life," she whispered, her voice rough with emotion, "I believed I was honoring my lost people by serving the empire that supposedly saved them. I pushed myself harder than anyone, endured the whispers and the insults, all to prove that it was worthy. And it was all a lie built on the bones of my real ancestors to turn me into a key to unlock a tomb. She took a deep, shuddering breath and looked towards the main chamber, towards the sleeping child. That little girl in there, she is my people. They are all my people. The mission the Empire gave me was a lie, but they have accidentally given me a true one. I am a guardian just like my ancestors were. My duty is to protect them. A new strength radiated from her, the transformation from a tool of the Empire to the protector of happening before his very eyes. The fury was returning, but it was no longer the defensive, impatient anger of an officer trying to prove herself. It was the righteous, focused rage of a queen defending her homeland. A small, genuine smile touched lips for the first time since they had landed on this cursed and beautiful world. He finished reassembling his rifle with a final, satisfying click. "A guardian needs a guard," he said simply. "You've still got one. You've got 5 of us." The moment hung in the air between them, a silent pact, an alliance forged in betrayal and cemented in a shared, impossible purpose. The formal barriers of rank had dissolved completely, leaving only 2 determined individuals, a man and a woman, facing down a galaxy. Later, as they gathered the whole squad around a holographic map of the Citadel that Gilly was now able to project from a console, the sheer absurdity of their situation settled in. "So," rumbled, scratching his beard, "we're 5 soldiers and one very small, very angry commander, trapped in a magic mountain, about to fight the entire Imperial Legion." "Did I miss anything?" Gilly looked up at the giant, a flicker of amusement in her eyes. "You forgot to mention the magic mountain can channel planet-wide lightning storms through its outer hull and that I'm learning how to control it." A slow grin spread across his face. Found himself chuckling, a rough, unused sound. "All right, so we have magic lightning on our side. Still, isn't going to just send a few troopers. He's going to send a butcher's bill. We need a real plan." As Gilly began to point out the Citadel's structural strengths and energy conduits, and translated them into choke points, fields of fire, and fallback positions, their argument took on a lighter, almost familial tone. "We can't seal that main gate," insisted, pointing at the entrance. "It's too wide. It's a tactical nightmare." "It is also the only entrance that can't be bypassed by orbital drills," Gilly retorted, her brow furrowed. "And I can collapse the passage behind them once they're inside." "You think you can," countered. "I'd prefer a plan that doesn't rely on you learning to use the alien fortress 5 minutes before the shooting starts." Gilly planted her small fists on her hips, looking up at him defiantly. "And I'd prefer a tactical sergeant who understands that our best weapon is the one thing they can't plan for. Stop thinking like an Imperial." The argument was sharp, but the underlying animosity was gone, replaced by the easy friction of 2 brilliant minds working towards a single goal. In the heart of the sleeping Citadel, surrounded by a lost race and hunted by a galactic empire, the tiny commander and her grizzled sergeant had found their new mission, and in doing so, had begun to find each other. The deceptive calm that had settled within the ancient Citadel was a fragile thing, a held breath before an inevitable plunge. In the days following their defiance of Admiral, and Gilly had worked with a frantic, focused energy, transforming the silent, crystalline tomb into a fortress ready for war. Drawing on a lifetime of defensive warfare, had turned the Citadel's labyrinthine corridors into a series of overlapping kill zones, mapping out fields of fire and preparing fallback positions with a grim and methodical expertise. His squad, their loyalty now absolute, worked tirelessly, reinforcing archways, setting up with fallen rubble, and positioning their limited heavy weapons to cover the most likely avenues of approach. While prepared for a war of corridors and plasma bolts, Gilly waged a different kind of preparation, one of mind and spirit. She spent long, silent hours in the main chamber, her hand pressed against the central crystal, her consciousness delving deeper into the Citadel's dormant systems. The fortress was slowly waking to her touch, its ancient mechanisms stirring from their eons of slumber, and she was learning its secrets, its language of energy and light. She discovered how to divert power between sectors, how to activate localized gravimetric plates, and how to feel the subtle vibrations of the very rock that formed their sanctuary, becoming the living nerve center of the mountain itself. The arrival of the Empire was not a surprise, but a certainty, and when it came not with subtlety, but with the brute force arrogance of a power that believed itself invincible. A deep, seismic tremor shook the citadel to its foundations, a vibration that had nothing to do with the planet's storms, followed by the distant, thunderous roar of engines tearing through the atmosphere. Their time had run out. The first wave of Imperial shock troopers breached the main gate exactly as had predicted, flooding into the vast entrance hall in a perfect, textbook assault formation, their white and red armor a stark, clinical intrusion in the organic, violet-lit darkness of the citadel. They advanced with disciplined precision, their pulse rifles sweeping every shadow, expecting to meet a small band of desperate, cornered fugitives. What they met instead was a meticulously prepared meat grinder. From concealed positions in the archways above, Rhino Squad opened fire, its heavy repeater scything through the lead ranks with devastating effect, the troopers' energy shields flaring brightly for an instant before their armor buckled under the onslaught. The Imperials, trained professionals to the last man, reacted instantly, their formations breaking as they sought cover behind fallen pillars, returning fire with a disciplined ferocity that turned the Grand Hall into a lethal crossfire of red and blue energy bolts. The battle was everything had trained for, a brutal, close-quarters firefight where angles, cover, and controlled bursts of fire were the keys to survival. Yet, for all their skill, his squad was hopelessly outnumbered, and he could see the Imperial forces beginning to push forward, their superior numbers allowing them to suppress his men's positions and gain ground inch by painstaking inch. "Gilly now," he yelled into his comm, his voice a low growl over the din of battle as he fired another controlled burst that sent a trooper diving for cover. "They're pushing through the central causeway." He received no verbal response, but he felt it, a sudden, strange shift in the very air of the chamber. A low hum resonated from the floor beneath the advancing troopers' feet, and the intricate patterns on the walls began to glow with a fierce, violet intensity. The Imperial soldiers hesitated for a fraction of a second, their advance faltering as they sensed the change. Then, with a sound like grinding stone and tearing metal, the floor of the great hall came alive. From hidden alcoves that had been sealed for, ancient defense drones activated, unfolding from their compact, resting states into sleek, multi-limbed constructs of gleaming black metal. They were unlike any Imperial drone design, moving with a fluid, predatory grace, their limbs ending in crackling energy emitters and razor-sharp appendages. The drones surged forward, a silent, metallic tide that crashed into the flank of the Imperial formation, their energy weapons firing at a frequency that seemed to bypass the troopers' shields entirely, cutting them down with terrifying efficiency. The orderly Imperial advance dissolved into a chaotic three-dimensional battle as troopers were forced to engage the new threat, their disciplined formations shattered. While they were reeling, Gilly sprung her second trap. With a surge of her will, she activated the gravimetric plates under the main causeway, tripling the force of gravity in that section for a split second. The effect was devastating. Troopers who had been running forward were slammed to the ground with bone-crushing force, their armor groaning under the sudden, immense pressure, making them easy targets for en route. The tide of the battle had turned in a heartbeat, not through superior firepower, but through a masterful and terrifying manipulation of the battlefield itself. Watched in grim satisfaction, picking off disoriented targets with his rifle, a profound and grudging respect for his commander's unique brand of warfare solidifying into something closer to awe. She wasn't just fighting with the Citadel, she was the Citadel. The Imperial commander, an officer whose face they could see on a field-level comms unit, was clearly no fool and adapted quickly to the unconventional threat. Realizing a direct assault was suicide, He pulled his forces back from the main hall and began a more methodical siege, using plasma charges to blast new entry points into the citadel's outer corridors, attempting to bypass prepared choke points. The fight became a brutal, running battle through the labyrinthine passages of the fortress, a deadly game of cat and mouse. And his squad were constantly on the move, falling back from one prepared position to the next, bleeding the Imperials for every foot of ground they took. Gilly, her consciousness now spread thin across the entire fortress, acted as their eyes and ears, warning them of enemy movements through their comms, her voice a constant, calming presence in the chaos. "Heavy weapons team approaching your position from the lower access tunnel," she would report, and would have repeater in position moments before the enemy rounded the corner. But the Imperials were relentless, their numbers seemingly endless, and the sheer attrition was taking its toll. Patches took a plasma bolt to the leg that his armor barely deflected, leaving him with a severe burn and a limp. Cora's head wound had reopened, and she fought on with a grim determination, a trickle of blood matting her hair. They were eventually forced back to a major junction, a nexus of several large corridors, where they made a desperate stand behind a hastily erected barricade of ancient stone. It was here the Imperials brought their heaviest firepower to bear, a tripod-mounted plasma cannon that began to systematically melt their cover, each impact sending molten rock and superheated shrapnel flying through the air. They were pinned down, the air thick with the smell of vaporized stone, the steady, thumping impacts of the plasma cannon a drumbeat counting down their final moments. It was in this moment of extreme duress, with death a near certainty, that a strange sense of calm washed over. He looked over at Gilly, who had joined them on the front line, her small hands glowing as she tried to draw more power from a nearby energy conduit to reinforce their position. She was covered in grime, her silver hair wild, her face set in a mask of fierce concentration, and he thought she had never looked more magnificent. A raw, incredulous laugh escaped his lips, a rough, barking sound that was utterly out of place in the hellish firefight. Gilly's head snapped towards him, her violet eyes wide with surprise. "You know," he shouted over the roar of the cannon, a genuine, reckless smile spreading across his face. "For a 3-foot-tall commander, you're not half bad in a fight." The sheer absurdity of the comment, the absolute gallows humor of it in their desperate situation, broke through her intense focus. A genuine, fiery smile, the first he had ever truly seen from her, lit up her face, transforming her features from a mask of fury into something breathtakingly beautiful. "For a lumbering human," she shouted back, her voice bright with a shared, defiant mirth, "you're almost competent, Sergeant." In that brief exchange, trapped behind a melting wall of rock with an army trying to kill them, something profound and unbreakable was forged between them, a bond of humor and affection that transcended the chaos of war. Their shared laugh was an act of rebellion more potent than any plasma bolt, a declaration that even in the face of annihilation, they were still alive, and they were together. It was this renewed spirit that fueled their final, desperate gambit. As Gilly drew on every ounce of her remaining strength to create a shimmering, violet shield of energy over their barricade, a temporary reprieve from the cannon's onslaught, laid out a simple, suicidal plan. The final Imperial assault was an overwhelming display of force, a full platoon of their most elite troopers charging down the main corridor under the cover of the plasma cannon's continuous fire. They advanced behind mobile energy shields, a slow, inexorable wall of death moving towards the nexus. This was the final push, the decapitation strike meant to crush the heart of their resistance. And his squad met the charge with a volley of grenades and a storm of pulse fire, but it was like throwing pebbles against a tidal wave. The Imperials were too numerous, too well shielded. It was then that Gilly put their desperate plan into motion. He provided a torrent of suppressing fire, forcing the troopers to keep their shields forward, while Gilly, her eyes closed in concentration, her hands outstretched, did something truly terrifying. She did not attack the troopers directly. She reached past them, her consciousness surging through the very bedrock of the citadel, extending beyond the fortress and into the raging storm outside. The humming in the chamber rose to an ear-splitting shriek, and the lights flickered violently. Outside, above the planet's surface, the perpetual lightning storm seemed to coalesce, dozens of smaller electrical storms merging into one supercell of unimaginable power, drawn to the citadel as if to a massive lightning rod. Stood his ground, firing his rifle until the power pack was nearly drained, defending the small, glowing woman who was about to unleash the wrath of a planet. Then, with a final, silent scream of her will, she brought the storm down. A single, colossal bolt of lightning, a pillar of pure, white-hot energy wider than a lance down from the heavens. It did not strike the battlefield, but the Imperial landing zone a kilometer away, a location she had pinpointed from the faint energy signatures of their ships. The resulting explosion was apocalyptic, a flash of light that momentarily turned the dark, stormy sky to brilliant daylight, followed by a shockwave that they felt even deep within the mountain. On the Imperial comms channel, which Cora had managed to patch into, the disciplined chatter turned to screams of panic and disbelief. They were gone, their support structure annihilated, their retreat cut off. The elite troopers in the corridor faltered, their invincible advance grinding to a halt as the reality of their situation hit them. They were stranded. Their siege was broken. In that moment of hesitation, and his squad counterattacked with a final furious charge, driving the shocked and demoralized Imperials back, their will to fight shattered. The battle was over. They had won. Found Gilly slumped against the wall, her glow faded, her body trembling with exhaustion but a triumphant, weary smile on her face. He knelt beside her, his own body screaming with pain and exhaustion, and placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. They had faced the full might of an Imperial battalion and survived, not just as a soldier and his commander, but as two halves of a single, devastating weapon. The aftermath of the battle was not marked by triumphant cheers, but by a profound and bone-deep silence that seemed to swallow the echoes of the last plasma blast. A fragile peace settled over the corridors of the citadel, a quiet punctuated by the pained groans of the wounded and the distant, ever-present roar of the planet's storms. Moved through the smoky haze of their final defensive position, his body a symphony of aches and bruises, his mind a calm sea after a hurricane. He methodically checked on his squad, his hands sure and steady as he helped Cora apply a fresh dressing to her head wound, and used his own strength to help reset his dislocated shoulder with a sickening, therapeutic pop. They were alive, all of them, a small miracle he did not take for granted, but the victory felt strangely hollow, the cost of it etched onto their exhausted faces and the scorched stone of the ancient fortress. His gaze was inevitably drawn to Gilly, who was slumped against a wall where he had left her, the incredible, world-shattering power she had unleashed having drained her completely, leaving her small form looking impossibly fragile. Her silver hair was fanned out against the dark stone, and her emerald skin was pale, the vibrant glow of her violet eyes dimmed to a soft, weary lavender. He knelt beside her, his large frame shielding her from the view of the others, and gently brushed a stray, grime-covered lock of hair from her face. Her eyes fluttered open, and she offered him a weak, tired smile that did more to wound his heart than any physical blow. In that moment, she was not the furious commander or the living weapon of the planet. She was just Gilly, a woman who had carried the weight of a forgotten world on her shoulders and had very nearly been crushed by it. He said nothing, simply uncorking his canteen and holding it to her lips, an offering of simple, human care that transcended any notion of rank or mission. As the immediate adrenaline of survival faded, the grim reality of their strategic situation began to set in, a cold and sobering dawn after the fiery night of battle. Cora, her fingers flying across a salvaged Imperial, managed to piece together a fragmented picture from the panicked, short-range comms chatter she had intercepted during the final assault. The lightning strike had been even more effective than they had hoped, not only obliterating the Imperial landing zone and their grounded, but also sending a catastrophic electromagnetic pulse upwards, a backlash of planetary fury that had crippled the Vindicator in high orbit. The warship was not destroyed, but its primary systems were fried, its weapons offline, and its drive inoperable. It was a wounded beast, forced to limp away on auxiliary power for a long, slow journey back to Imperial space. The immediate threat from above was gone, leaving isolated, a forgotten star in a hostile galaxy, which was the greatest victory they could have possibly achieved. However, this triumph left them with a complex and dangerous problem on the ground. Several hundred elite Imperial shock troopers, the survivors of the ground assault, were now stranded, their command structure shattered, their retreat cut off, a wounded and cornered animal that was still eminently lethal. The obvious, tactical solution was to hunt them down, to use Gilly's connection to the Citadel to track their movements and eliminate them before they could regroup and pose a future threat. His face a grim mask, had advocated for this very course of action, arguing that leaving such a force alive was a mistake that would inevitably come back to haunt them, a sentiment that the cold, pragmatic soldier readily understood. Yet, as he looked at the weary faces of his own small squad and the immense, silent chamber of sleeping, the thought of more killing, of methodically hunting down and slaughtering men who were now just as trapped as they were, left a bitter taste in his mouth. He thought of his own long, bloody history, of the evacuation, of the countless times he had followed orders that led to pointless death, and he realized that he was no longer the same man who had stepped into the briefing room on the Vindicator. The Empire had abandoned those troopers just as it had abandoned the colonists just as it had planned to abandon and murder Gilly. They were not his enemies anymore. They were victims of the same cruel, uncaring machine. He found Gilly in the antechamber they had been using as a command center, where she was studying a holographic map of the Citadel's exterior, her strength slowly returning. He stood before her, the full weight of his decision settling upon him, and laid out his unconventional, almost treasonous proposal. He would not lead a hunting party. Instead, he would go out under a flag of truce and offer the stranded Imperials a choice, a chance to lay down their arms not as prisoners, but as colonists, as the first citizens of a new, independent. He would offer them a future free from the empire that had left them to die, a life built with their own hands on a world that would belong to them, a pardon in exchange for their skills, their knowledge, and their loyalty to the world that was now their only home. Gilly listened to his impassioned argument in silence, her violet eyes searching his face, and when he was finished she gave him a slow, thoughtful nod. "You are not the man I thought you were," she said softly, her voice filled with a new and profound respect. "You are better. Go, offer them your peace. But if they refuse it, I will give them a war that will make their old masters tremble." The parley took place on a windswept plateau a few kilometers from the Citadel, a neutral ground where the endless storm seemed to momentarily abate, as if the planet itself were holding its breath. When alone, his pulse rifle slung over his back in a sign of non-aggression, his broad shoulders squared against the wind as he approached the makeshift Imperial encampment. He was met by a weary, battle-scarred captain, the ranking survivor of the Imperial command, a man whose eyes held the same disillusionment recognized in himself. He laid out his offer, his voice clear and steady over the howl of the wind, speaking not as a conqueror but as a fellow soldier who understood the bitter sting of betrayal. He spoke of the Empire's lies, of the true nature of their mission, and of the future they could build together, a future of purpose and freedom far from the reach of admirals and emperors who saw them only as expendable pawns. There was skepticism, anger, and suspicion amongst the assembled troopers, but words, backed by the undeniable truth of their abandonment, found fertile ground in their weary souls. After a tense negotiation, the captain, speaking for the majority of his surviving force, accepted the terms. A new and fragile alliance was born on that stormy plateau, a compact between former enemies united by a shared desire to simply live, to build something new from the ashes of their old lives. The surrender was not a moment of shame, but one of dignified transition, as hundreds of imperial soldiers laid down the weapons of an empire that no longer claimed them and took up the promise of a future they would forge for themselves. In the days of peace that followed, a new and vibrant energy began to fill the ancient citadel. The former imperial troopers, with their technical expertise and disciplined work ethic, proved to be an invaluable asset, working alongside Rhino Squad to secure the fortress, establish hydroponic gardens in the lower levels, and begin the monumental task of transforming their prison into a home. A new society, a strange and unprecedented blend of human tenacity and mystery, was taking its first, tentative steps. With the immediate threat of war and survival finally behind them, the unspoken tension between and Gilly could no longer be ignored, a quiet, powerful current that flowed between them in every shared glance and brief touch. One evening, as the twin suns were setting, casting long, dramatic shadows across the storm-tossed landscape, he found her standing on a high balcony overlooking the planet, a place she had told him was used for meditation by the ancient stargazers. The wind whipped her silver hair around her, and the violet light of the citadel's crystals reflected in her eyes, making her seem both impossibly powerful and achingly beautiful. He came to stand beside her, the familiar, comfortable silence stretching between them as they watched the endless, majestic dance of the lightning below. "The Empire will be back eventually," said, his voice a low rumble that did not break the quiet but became a part of it. "They won't forget a world like this. They won't forgive us." Gilly did not turn to look at him, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Let them come," she replied, her voice filled with a calm, unshakable confidence that resonated with the power of the planet itself. She was no longer just a commander or a survivor. She was the heart of this world, its guardian and its queen. "We will be ready for them." He looked at her, at the fierce determination in her profile, at the small, indomitable leader who had saved them all, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his life as an imperial soldier was well and truly over. His future was here, on this wild and beautiful world at her side. "And what's my role in this new future you're building, Commander?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. She finally turned to face him, her small form seeming to radiate an inner warmth that held the chill of the wind at bay. She reached out and for the first time took his large hand in both of hers, her touch sending a jolt through him that had nothing to do with the planet's storms. She looked up at him, her violet eyes holding his, all traces of her former fury gone, replaced by an emotion so open and profound it stole his breath. "You told me once, Sergeant, that you follow your commander's orders," she said, a slow, radiant smile playing on her lips. "My first order is this: stay with me." A deep, genuine smile, the kind he thought he had forgotten how to make, spread across his face, easing the weary lines etched there by years of war. He gently squeezed her hands, his thumb stroking the back of her emerald skin. "Affirmative, Commander," he replied, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Some orders are just easier to follow than others." He then lowered his head and she rose on her toes, their lips meeting in a kiss that was both a surrender and a promise, a final, definitive treaty signed in the heart of the storm. As they stood together on the high balcony, no longer just a soldier and his commander, but partners in every sense of the word, a fragile peace settled not just over the citadel, but over their own turbulent hearts. Below them, the first lights of their new colony began to flicker to life, small points of warmth and hope in the vast, wild darkness. Their war was over, but their true mission, the task of building a future and awakening a world, had just begun, and they would face it together.